Google Stadia is here, and over the past 8 months I've spent a rather significant amount of my gaming time with it. As mentioned in previous Stadia-related videos, I've had prior experience in the cloud gaming space, such as OnLive, Gaikai, PlayStation Now, Shadow PC, and GeForce Now. So let me just say this out of the gate. The novelty of what cloud gaming is and whether or not it works wore off on me many years ago. Yes, it does work. It has been working in a mainstream consumer capacity since the early 2010s, but that doesn't necessarily stop me from being curious about each new service or platform that pops up every other year or so. Which brings me back to Stadia. What are my thoughts on Stadia as a platform 8 months after release? To kick this thing off, let's talk a bit about how the platform has evolved over this time. When Stadia was revealed back in 2019 at GDC, I think it would come to no one's surprise if I said that they were certainly ambitious. You could practically feel the level of excitement they had for what they believe will be the future of video games, even if they didn't start the event off on the right foot, so to speak.
I suppose I should start out with a confession. I'm actually not a big gamer, though I do play FIFA 19 quite a bit.
They were quick to hit us with the kinds of things that were only possible in the cloud, such as the power of multi-GPU instances that could do things a single GPU instance could not, or being able to use Google Assistant to, well, assist you in games that you find yourself struggling with. They advertised being able to stream games up to 4K 60 FPS, and that the compute power of Stadia was more powerful than the PS4 Pro and the Xbox One X combined. They advertised YouTube streaming, crowdplay, state share, game share, and Stream Connect. Personally, these were the things that got me excited about what Google was bringing to the table with cloud gaming. As I mentioned before, the novelty of it working died off a long time ago, but these new features were certainly convincing enough to get my attention. Fast forward $130 later into the launch of Stadia, and my excitement was admittedly hollowed out. The rollout of access codes was poorly handled to the point where the official Discord and the Reddit page had people compiling data to figure out what order people were receiving codes and what time codes were being distributed each day. And to make matters worse, the features that were paraded about at GDC were nowhere to be found. And what of the up to 4K 60 FPS that was advertised? At the time, only a small handful of the few games on the platform were true 4K. The rest were upscaled from a lower resolution. It was a bad look, and with a gaming community that wanted to see Stadia die from the very day it was announced, now they smell blood in the water. And new YouTube SEO to make money from, let's be real here. But what of the actual platform itself? Is it really as bad as the industry wants you to believe? The first month of Stadia's release was an interesting one. In a way, it felt like what I was experiencing was in a completely different bubble as to what journalists and YouTubers were claiming. The games were scarce, but the few games that were there weren't exactly bad either. Once I received my Founders Kit, finally, and synced up my controller, I decided I would try to play one game that would really be a test of the platform's latency: Destiny 2. What made this the perfect test for me was that I already owned the game on 2 other platforms, PC and console. Thus I had a pretty good idea of how the game should feel. Contrary to the claims that Stadia has no input lag, or too much input lag, it felt as to be expected. There was noticeable input lag to the point where I had to reprogram my brain to adjust and compensate for potential over and under aiming, but it was in no way unplayable. This felt all too similar with my experience in playing FPS games on OnLive, GeForce Now, and Shadow. Noticeable input lag, but not enough to ruin the experience. And nothing close to the Washington Post video that showed up right around launch. Simply put, if you're experiencing that type of input latency when using Stadia, you may want to take a good look at your own home network. Of course, saying that my experience is the correct one would be narrow-minded, as different people have different sensitivities to input lag. I also tried out the other pro games such as Samurai Showdown and Farming Simulator, and the experience was virtually the same in terms of input lag. Samurai Showdown would have been impressive to me if I hadn't already played Street Fighter 4 back in the OnLive days. Fighting games have worked on cloud gaming platforms before, so again, it was no surprise that Stadia nailed the "does it work" part. The most disappointing thing about the launch for me were the missing features that were advertised during GDC. It tells an interesting story when the Stadia controller comes with a Google Assistant button, yet at launch, the Assistant button wasn't functional at all. Even worse, when most of the platform's functionality, aside from actually playing the games, was limited to the mobile app only. You couldn't even buy games anywhere else but on the mobile app. Convenient if you're always on your phone, but frustrating when you're playing on PC or the Chromecast and want to be able to do it all in one place. Stream Connect was nowhere to be found, nor was Crowdplay, StateShare, or even YouTube streaming. Topping the whole thing off, where the higher quality bitrate is locked behind the 4K Stadia Pro paywall, and Doom Eternal, one of the flagship games for the platform, got delayed. Something that was completely out of Stadia's hands, obviously, and you can see how this all adds up. When taking a step back to look at what the launch was as a whole, to me it didn't scream that Stadia was a failure, more so than it being a rushed product. One that definitely could use more time in the incubator, but in a world where people clearly want the platform to fail, this was everything they needed to convince themselves that it will. Over the following months, the Stadia team has slowly but surely tackled a few of the major issues that people had with the platform. The lack of games and communication being some of the most common complaints. As time went on, they eventually created their own separate forums and blog to keep people updated on new features and games that were on the way. Personally, this was pleasant news as a former OnLive user, a product of which didn't even have its own separate forums until the company filed for bankruptcy, relaunched under a new code name, and completely changed its business model in terms of how games were distributed on the platform. So the Stadia team taking steps forward like this in advance was good news to me, as it meant that they were quickly working to address issues with the platform. Hell, they even managed to get a pretty basic achievement system in place, something that the Epic Games Store still lacks to this day. When it comes to true Stadia exclusive features, most of them still have yet to be seen. Stream Connect made its debut with the launch of Ghost Recon Breakpoint on the platform and showcased how useful it can be in a multiplayer session, but also made it clear that many of Stadia's features were dependent on developers implementing them into their games. As the months progressed, it demonstrated just how few developers were taking advantage of them. Ubisoft being one of the few major publishers willing to demonstrate what the platform can do by implementing Stream Connect in both Breakpoint and The Division 2. Other features such as Crowdplay, StateShare, YouTube streaming, or even a game that takes advantage of the power of cloud gaming was nowhere to be found. At least for a while anyway. The release of games like Crata, Get Packed, and Mortal Kombat 11 are the few games aiming to bring these features to fruition, but many of them are still in beta form to this day. But seeing progress being made on these features shows that work is actually being done. This is a positive. But as the library increases, the amount of games actually using Stadia features isn't exactly one-to-one. Speaking of games, over the following months since launch, Stadia's library has been growing steadily. At one point, there was concern over the idea that Stadia's free pro games would eventually overtake its entire collection, as the selection was sparse at the time. But the Stadia team had found a way around this problem by not only releasing more games, but even including new releases into Stadia Pro's free games each month. I found my collection of Stadia games growing continuously without having to spend any more than the usual $10 monthly fee. Of course, there are those that compare it to Xbox Game Pass, which arguably has the best value in gaming today. But Stadia Pro's continually growing library is certainly nothing to sneeze at. At the time of this recording, I have well over 30 games in my library, most of which are Stadia Pro games. One of the negatives of this subscription model is that, just like Game Pass, games do rotate out of the lineup. But based on what has been seen so far, there's a rather long period of time before a game actually gets removed from the Pro lineup. These games don't get removed from Stadia as a whole, so they can still be purchased outright if the period to claim it with Pro has expired. Or if you've already claimed the game with Pro, it's never removed from your library even after it's been rotated out. Simply put, Stadia is slowly rectifying its game problem and is currently sitting at over 60 titles on the platform so far, as opposed to the 20 or so it had at launch. Yes, it's not Game Pass level, but for something that didn't really exist until a few years ago, it's worth taking note of. It can't be denied that Stadia has made some improvements to the overall functionality of the platform, some of which was based on community feedback. For example, the ability to change data use and performance per device, or literally adjusting the appearance of the notification pop-up the next day based off of feedback of where it was placed, or adding free play weekends because users felt left out in the cold each time a game had a free play weekend anywhere else. It does show that they are indeed listening to the community, but what was interesting to me personally is the speed of which these changes can be implemented due to Stadia being a living and ever-changing ecosystem. Because of this, you're not downloading firmware updates to make these changes like you would on other platforms. It's convenient. Over time, they eventually added web support for the Stadia controller, 4K streaming, and 5.1 surround sound. But these were a given. Google Assistant functionality was eventually added to the Chromecast Ultra, but in a very limited fashion. While you can certainly ask it to do things like launch games or even look up specific info about a game, you still can't ask it to help you in-game in the way they showed during the GDC presentation. Apart from all that, its reliability is also questionable. Launch Metro 2033 Redux.
According to Wikipedia, on the 22nd of May 2014, a Redux version of the game was announced. It uses the latest version of the 4A engine, bringing the
Launch Metro 2033. It's safe to say that Google Stadia's future is still up in the air, and there's an entire industry watching from the sidelines to see what that future actually is. But to say that the Stadia team is sitting on their hands doing absolutely nothing would be pretty dismissive of what's actually going on with the platform and how much it's grown over the past 8 months. From the outside, it may not seem like much, but I'd argue that this proves just how much work needs to be done in the face of the public and behind the scenes to prove the viability of the platform and its future. But as a former OnLive fan, I have to tip my hat to Google and the Stadia team for onboarding publishers and developers in less than a year that OnLive never managed to get in the 6-year span of its life. That's not to say that this guarantees Stadia's permanence in the industry, but an effort is at least being made. Now for the big question that some of you may be wondering. Is Stadia worth getting into now? If you had asked me this question 5 months ago, I would have told you no. But with them finally removing the $130 paywall and giving new users a 1-month free Stadia Pro trial, I say to try it for yourself and see if it works for you. You've got nothing to lose but time, and if you've watched this video all the way through to the end, you clearly have enough to give it a shot. If you enjoyed this video all the way through to the end, then do me a favor and hit that like button. Maybe even subscribe to motivate me into creating more content like this. Leave a comment to feed the YouTube algorithm and help this video get seen by more eyes. If you want to support, there's a Patreon page that you can find in the comments below, as well as Twitter, Discord, and even a Twitch channel. Crazy, right? As always, this is Corrupt Ronin telling you to stay sharp, assassins, and I'll see you next time.